Hey guys, welcome back to Enlightened Tale. It's your host Kev here. Hope you all had lovely holidays. Hope you enjoyed the celebrations for the new year, spending time with your family and stuff. If you're lucky to have family, if not, my apologies. Yes, the last couple of weeks I've been meaning to get this video out. Unfortunately, I've not been feeling too well, like a lot of people during this wintry period. And it took a little bit longer to kick the leggy than I thought. But we're back on the mend now, so I wanted to try and get this down. Obviously, I did write this out in mind of it being recorded a few weeks back, and I did do the automated recording and put it out there, but I really wasn't happy with the quality of it, and there felt like a disconnect between myself, the information, and the listeners. So, well, that's what I thought when I listened back to it. I just didn't like it at all. So, I hope you're all comfortable and you're all ready. This is going to be a pretty long video. And without further ado, let's get straight into it. The famous story of the Trojan War comes from the ancient historian Homer, who is said by the mainstream to have lived around the 8th to 12th century BCE. This is the window of time attributed to the Trojan War, which is a pretty wide window of time, which will be widened further as we shall see later. Unfortunately, no copies of Homer's original writings have survived, leading some to question the validity of the man and the authenticity of his poems. There will be more to discuss regarding Homer the person, who he was, where he came from, etc. later down the line. You will start to see as well as we move through this information, there's a common theme of originals not surviving, which, as people who look into historical things, you find this a lot really. But here in this part, we shall look to some of the writings and try to build a picture of the land occupied by the Trojans, as well as lay some foundations for future videos. The oldest known copy of the alleged Greek author's epic that I could find was the Vinicius A manuscript, or Vinicius A, is the more common name for the 10th century manuscript codex, which is catalogued in the Bibliotheca Marciana in Venice as Codex Marcianus Gracchus 454. Its name is Latin for Venetian A, which makes me think of, you got during the Renaissance in Italy, you had the Venice, Venetian style of art, architecture and science, theology, and then you had Florence, your Michelangelos and all the more religious and spiritual, philosophical elements of the Renaissance. So it's interesting that it's in the Venetian A, because it just makes me think of that. Unfortunately, none of the works on which the scholia in Vinicius A survive are based. Again, a reoccurring theme. As a result, the task of tracing their contents to their sources has been difficult. The study of the Iliadic scholia is a significant and ongoing area of research in Homeric scholarship, and I have been unable to find an English translation as of yet. So if anyone does know of an English translation of the A Scholia and the Vinicius A, please forward it towards me. The A Scholia, for which Vinicius A is by far the most important source, is derived from the so-called VMK. Now excuse me while I try to pronounce this name. Viemana Commenta. It's a long word. I'll put a picture on the screen for people. Otherwise known as the four-man commentary. It's otherwise translated as the four-man commentary. Named for the four ancient scholars Aristarchus, Didymus, Herodian and Nicanor. The main source for the A Scholia was probably a compilation of their work rather than each of the four-man's work individually, and this is all according to Wikipedia. Because four of these scholars worked in the tradition of the well-known Alexandrian scholar Aristarchus, It is thought that much of the A Scholia can be traced to Aristarchus himself, to which later translations and iterations stem from. Now, there's a bit of hyperbole in there, because they don't know who wrote the original source material of the scholia in the Vinicius, but yet at the same time they try to tell you that it goes back to Aristarchus. So who knows, again, with all this information, I'm not going to try and project any of this stuff to people as facts. These are all smart individuals. I'm going to lay this information out as broadly as I can and try and streamline it and let you all make up your own mind, because there's a lot of ideology, there's a lot of data that the originals, as I say, don't survive, so it is open to interpretation. And just speaking of which, makes me think of a body of works written by one Snorri Sturluson, known as the Prose Edda, written around the 12th century. His writings on Norse history is believed to be the largest compilation of older texts. Again, not the originals, but compilation of older texts, and this is the 12th century. His Prose Edda is also the greatest and largest source of material and knowledge from pre-medieval Norse mythological beliefs and tales. I have made a couple of short videos on this work which I find fascinating. Perhaps we shall cover this work in greater detail in the future, and perhaps we shall. For now though, let us get back to Homer's poems. These poems involve Paris, who was the Prince of Troy and son of Priam, the wealthy ruler of Troy. Priam had many sons, whom we shall come across, including Hector, a great warrior and valiant general, famous and loved as the protector of Troy's defences, having fought also in former campaigns as well as the Trojan War, which we shall come to later. Paris became embroiled in a tug of war between three goddesses, which included Hera, Zeus's wife, Athena, Zeus's daughter, and Aphrodite, the goddess of sexuality and love. Each of the three goddesses wished to be named the most beautiful and receive a much desired golden apple as a trophy. All three goddesses believed the apple was destined for her. Zeus, of course, not wanting to get drawn into choosing between these powerful goddesses, sends the trio along with his messenger Hermes, the god of wisdom, otherwise known as Mercury to the Romans and Thoth to the Egyptians, to nominate the mortal Paris as a judge. Now, interesting to note that as we move through this video, I will mention Atlantis very briefly. It's not the focus of the video, but I have to mention it when I come onto Plato and stuff. Now, the thing is, Thoth also went by the name of Tahuti to some people, but we won't go there. And Thoth was supposed to be a mortal man by some tradition, who was later venerated and deified, indeed transcended into the pantheon of Egyptian gods. While there's other ideologies, other scripture type stuff, like the Emerald Tablets of Thoth, like that go way back, not into thousands of years ago, but there's like Islamic iterations of Thoth and things like this going back to like the last 600-700 years, and there's other bits and bobs. No originals survive, of course, indeed, such as the Emerald Tablet, who discuss Thoth being an Atlantean who comes to the area of Egypt, and he turns the barbarians into enlightened individuals, and that is the birth of the Egyptian culture in essence. Like I say, I'm not going to go too far into that, but it's very interesting that like Thoth, Egypt, we're going to come on to things like that in future videos. The work of Comines Beaumont, if anyone's read any of his works, it's fascinating. Let's leave it there. So Paris, whom also went by the name Alexander in some texts, was known for lying with women of beauty and had a taste for the finer things of life. Saucy chap. In return for his judgment, he made a request to obtain the fairest and most beautiful woman in the world, which led to Paris gaining the possession of Helen of Sparta, who was betrothed and soon to be the wife of the High King Agamemnon's brother, Menelaus. This capturing of Helen is said to be the catalyst for the war that launched 1,000 ships from across Greece into Anatolia. But was it? Who were the Trojans? Who were the Greeks? Well, in this video and future videos, we will look to explore these and more questions of the timeline, linguistical, etymological, geographical, archaeological, and scholarly data from as many sources as I can gather. We shall learn more of the details of the Trojan War and the travels of one of its triumphant heroes, Odeyseus, as we go further in later videos. As we go forth in later videos, apologies, and that will be towards the back end. I also found the works of Wilson and Blackett, Iman Wilkins, Marshall Abrahams, and the recently passed legend, Mr. Ross Broadstock, to name but a few authors in my research who discussed the potentiality of one or more Trojan Wars, also in more than one location, or indeed in completely different centuries, #millennia. Wilson and Blackett are two authors who have done incredible work on a range of other historical topics who will come into play later. For example, they believe the war took place in the 7th century BCE over in Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, which is the mainstream location found by Schliemann known as Hisarlik, which we shall see is not suitable for the location for many reasons on this quest. Iman and Marshall, on the other hand, believe the war took place in Cambridgeshire, England, with Iman, Marshall and Ross believing there were two conflicts, not just the one. One war taking place in the Eastern Mediterranean and the other in England, one in the 2nd millennium BC and the other in the 7th century BCE. These and other researchers have presented a plethora of source material to digest and index, and there are other ancient historians to research which have provided information along the way, which, to be fair, these have been the books I've been going through at this moment in time, and you find a lot of information online. There's a lot of PDFs, such as we'll come on to in just a moment's time, Darius the Phrygian, which I am probably going to order a book, see if I can find a good book with a hard copy of his information. But there's so much information that's out there that you've got to sift through, and it's been quite an undertaking, to be honest with you guys. And as I said a moment ago, add into this group of researchers the older writings of one Darius the Phrygian, who allegedly was part of the Trojan contingent who fought in the war, indeed allegedly being part of the 10-year siege. Some claim Darius to hail from a town named Daresbury, near the ancient town of Chester, close to the River Mersey in the northwest of England. The thought that the war took place in England is East Anglia, that's over on the east coast. Darius, as I say, there's a place called Daresbury, as we shall touch on now, and the spelling of the town shares his namesake, so one cannot rule out this notion of Daresbury was his Iron Age residency completely, to be honest. And though the area is ancient and has got like many Iron Age earthworks, and was allegedly later held by the Romans centuries after Darius' time, perhaps more research in the future with some credible links can be found, and I do plan on, as I say, looking further into Darius. So Daresbury, or Daresbury, was also the birthplace of Alice in Wonderland author Lewis C. Carroll, or is it just Lewis Carroll, in All Saints Vicarage, which is fitting considering like this channel we go down many rabbit holes and we decided to stay there, didn't we? So please consider giving us a thumbs up on that one, guys. Around 120 Bronze Age barrows are known in the county, lying principally on the glacial sands of central Cheshire, the alluvial river terraces, and in the Pennine uplands. Finds from this period are plentiful, including at least 8 Bronze Age axes in the last few years, suggesting significant human activity in Cheshire during the Bronze Age. Back to Darius, he tells in his account of a war not involving disputing gods and mythological powers of incredible feats, at least to the extent Homer does. Well, is it Homer? Who knows? Feats such as Aphrodite, who Paris chose during his judgment of the goddesses, who appears during Paris and Menelaus' duel of single combat, out of nowhere to transport Paris in a cloud of smoke away from the battlefield and back to his chambers in Troy. The version by Darius gives great description of the battles and the men who fought in them, even discussing how the aforementioned Aeneas, grandfather of Brutus, survived the epic siege. I recommend reading his works, even if only for comparison to Homer's versions of events alone. Could the date and location of the Trojan War be wrong? Could there have been 2 Trojan Wars? Well, let us start to unpack the Homeric poems and see what we can extrapolate, starting with the climate and geography. The climate of eastern England in the northwest of Europe has a differing climate to that of Anatolia in southwest Turkey, the far eastern end of the Mediterranean. To start off, Homer mentions the torrential rain that often accompanied the warring soldiers on the battlefield. He used a very intriguing word to describe the rains, athefastos. Sorry, some of these words are so difficult to pronounce. Athefastos, which translates generally into the phrase, "what even a god cannot measure." This indicates never-ending and persistent rainfall, which is typical of the climate of the North Atlantic regions, both in Europe and across the Atlantic in North America. The climate in Anatolia, however, has more random rains, brought about by sudden shifts in temperature and pressure. One might expect to find an adjective such as sudden, or a phrase coined more along the lines of, "when a god felt the need, it rained," or something of that ilk, rather than a reference to constant heavy rains. Homer mentions how Zeus had a hand in the weather, and I quote now, "Zeus rained ever continually, that the sooner he might whelm the wall in salt and sea," unquote. That was in the Homeric poems, by the way. The thick mists mentioned also by Homer is another indicator of a more temperate climate, which can be found in the famous British countrysides. Known for its foggy and rainy days, whilst the mention of strong northerly winds with cold weather and the falling of ice and snow is indicative of the northerly weather systems pushing down the North Sea, or as someone like Imam Wilkins would say, the Hellas Sea. Strong northerly winds can also be found at Hisarlik, situated at the Dardanelles, yet nowhere in the Iliad does it make reference to a Mediterranean climate of warmer temperatures and arid soil, which can be observed in southwest Turkey. He simply does not mention in the Iliad. There's people who've made assumptions and things like that, but if you read the poems, there's absolutely no mention of this arid climate. Here are a couple of quotes from Homer himself. "Now, when they were marshalled, the several companies with their captains, the Trojans, came on with a clamour and a cry like birds, even as the clamour of cranes arises before the face of heaven, when they flee from wintry storms and merciless rains, and with a clamour fly towards the streams of the ocean. A mist that a shepherd loves not, but that to the robber is better than night, and a man can only see as far as he can cast a stone." So as you see there, torrential heavy rains and thick fogs. You can only see as far as you can throw a stone, unquote, / quote, unquote. Certain references to plants and trees are littered throughout the Iliad, whilst ash, elm and oak trees can be found in varying climates. The beech, black poplars and willow trees are found in more temperate environments, generally requiring deep, moist soil, and as such can be found along the rivers and near lakes of the more temperate zones of northwest Europe. Homer also mentions thick turf, which I presume is grass, to be honest, which is not usually associated with warmer climates in the Mediterranean. Great fields of wheat, lush flowering meadows and orchards, as well as springs, are described, which sounds like an area lush in vegetation. There is mention of various dikes also in the Iliad, of which are rather rare in ancient Greece, but can be found all over the low-lying lands in northwestern Europe, used for diverting rainfall and also protection, in warfare that is, not just from the elements, but from raiding enemies. Homer calls these dikes the splendid work of young men, unquote. The Roman philosopher Strabo, claiming, I quote, that the floods in Europe are the cause of more deaths than war. So water was obviously with the flooding and things like that, rivers bursting and all this kind of stuff, the low-lying lands were susceptible for a lot of fatalities. There are also a huge number of Iron Age dikes to be found across eastern England dating back to the Iron Age. The most notorious of these dikes goes by the name Devil's Dyke, which is a great war dike. Devil's Dyke is the remains of a prehistoric defensive ditch which lies at the east side of the village of Wheathampstead in Hertfordshire, England. It is protected as a scheduled monument and is alleged to have been part of the defences of an Iron Age settlement belonging to the Catuvellauni tribe of Britain. This is the largest of the war dikes to be found, but is one of many. The plain on which the armies seized each other up and the battles took place will be discussed later during the archaeological research segment. Apologies, I am tripping over my tongue left, right and centre here. I'm just still not with it, am I? I will just say briefly that many today imagine the walls of Troy to be high and thick stone walls, when in fact Homer only makes one reference to the walls of the conflict, in which he uses the term dikes of battle. So just think about that. We all think of the movie, probably in the mind's eye. You think of all the archers on the wall and, the Hector and the Trojans out front. But there's no reference to this great wall. Quote, even beneath Agamemnon, son of Atreus, fell the heads of the Trojans as they fled, and many horses with high arched backs rattled empty cars over the dikes of battle, lacking their peerless charioteers, who were lying on the ground, dearer far to the vultures than their wives, unquote. So you had masses of chariots riding over the war dikes without charioteers, where they'd fell off and been shot or things like that. And to be honest, we shall discuss horses and chariots later, which is, you'd be surprised, to be honest, some of the information there. Quoting Homer again now, so they took their stand in the flowery mead of Scamander, numberless as are the leaves and the flowers in their season, even as their generations of leaves, such as those also of men. As for the leaves, the wind scattereth some upon the earth, but the forest putteth forth others. When the season of spring is come, even so of men, one generation spring up, and another passeth away. For he stormed across the plain like unto a winter torrent at the full, that with its swift flood sweeps away the embankments. This the close fenced embankments hold not back, neither do the walls of the fruitful vineyards and orchards stay it sudden when the rains of Zeus driveth it on. And before it In multitudes, the fair works of men fell in ruin. Even in such wise before Troy, Tydeus' son, were the thick battalions of the Trojans driven out. Unquote. Here is a quote from the Celtic bard Taliesin regarding the Celtic struggle with the surging waters and things like that. And I quote, "The storm raged for 4 nights in the summer. Then men fell, and the woods themselves were no longer any protection against the winds from the sea. Math and Heved, masters of magic and wand, had liberated the elements. The Gwydion and Amethion held council. They made a shield so strong that the sea could not engulf the best troops." It's interesting that he makes reference there, that was unquote by the way, Math and Heved, masters of magic and wand, makes me think of Merlin, makes me think of Celtic sorcery, rather than, I've never heard any Greek or anyone over in Greece actually having a magic wand. Maybe Hermes, he has a Odeyseus, but that's about it. The Scamander River mentioned by Homer could potentially be the River Ouse, as we shall see, which is a powerful river located on the side of the plains and battlefield laid between the city of Troy and the coastal encampment to which the ships were rested. The River Ouse has several other rivers that feed into it and is prone to seasonal flooding due to the heavy rainfall that can turn the river into a muddy torrent of great force, sweeping away all in its path. The strong shield against the sea, according to Imman, sounds like a water dike protecting the soldiers, which is a familiar sight of the 20th century, when dikes were erected on the River Thames in England and the Schelde in Holland, designed to protect the riverbanks when storms swell and the water levels rise. Speaking of rivers, rivers are the ancient highways, and in most cases, just like lakes, they carry their original names in one form or another, depending on etymological evolution in areas of the said bodies of water. Homer happens to mention 9 rivers in the Iliad, of which all can be placed in the region of Troy of eastern Britain. I shall share a couple of these river names and their evolution to modern names in no particular order. I shall use the Greek words first and then use the usual etymological render and finally the modern name. First is the river Kares, that's K-R-E-S. Then Keres, which you replace the K with a C. Later then back to Kares with the K in the Middle Ages, and today Kares is known today as just Car, C-A-R, or otherwise known as Car's Dyke. So the K or the C and the A and the R has survived where the ES has been removed. Next up is the Axi, A-X-I, rendered to Axi, and today known as Exi, E-X-E. The X remaining steadfast through the ages. Finally, we shall look at the Ouse, or salamander of the Iliad, oldest name being Santi Ois to Santi Ois, known today as Little Ouse. The evolution is clear in the wording of all 9 rivers, and to be honest, like I say, this came from this book, Imman Wilkins, and I'd advise anybody to purchase this book. It's not the easiest book to get your hands on, if I'm being honest. This was the last copy available on Amazon at the time when I purchased it. There might be more available now, so hopefully you can all have a little look into that yourselves. As mentioned, the enemy of the Trojans were the Achaeans, a race of, I quote, fair and bright-eyed peoples, unquote, leading one to assume warriors fair in complexion with blue eyes, much like the Nordic races of Northern Europe, around the North and Baltic Seas. Again, we have more to discuss on this later. Still, the Achaeans, even according to the mainstream sources are said to be the ancestors of the Greeks. So even though you do get some translations where people call the Achaeans the Greeks, the Achaeans are actually the ancestors of the Greeks, older. Hence the use of the word Greeks, used to describe these peoples in some translations. It is also accepted that the Achaeans are an Indo-European race that invaded the area of Greece today from the north, though the debate still rages to if this was an invasion or resettling, and whether it was by land or by sea. Some researchers believe the Achaeans were no other than the infamous sea peoples, who came from the Atlantic coastal regions, whom caused major disruption around the Mediterranean. Is it possible that refugees from a war in England in the 11th century BCE settled in the areas around the Aegean Sea between Greece and Turkey? Could the story of the Trojan War, the mythology and language have migrated with them? One may presume that the Achaeans, or the Achoi, as actually described by Homer, meant sea peoples, deriving from the Indo-Germanic aqua, meaning water or stream, later becoming the Gothic acha, and then later the Latin aqua. This evolution continues around the major civilizations of the Mediterranean. We're talking etymologically now. The word Ahijawa by the Hittites in Asia Minor and Akiwasa by the Egyptians both roughly means the sea or water peoples. Interesting to note there, on a side note, that the Hittites, who were the main dominating force also in that region, make no reference of a Trojan War and 1,000 ships sailing across the Aegean. There's absolutely no reference to it whatsoever, but they do make reference to the famous conflict with Ramesses, but that's for another time. The iteration Acheawa, Achewia, found in Linear B, seems to be the oldest known name of Greece, translating into land of sea people. Linear B was a syllabic script used for writing in Mycenaean Greek, the earliest attested form of Greek. The script predates the Greek alphabet by several centuries, with the oldest Mycenaean writing dating to around 1400 BCE. It is descended from the older Linear A, an undeciphered earlier script used for writing the Minoan language. We'll have more to come on the writing systems later, to be fair. Homer makes mentions of the, quote, Argives and Danans, sometimes when referencing the attacking forces of the war. People generally accept the former to mean that of the Isle of Argos in the Mediterranean. However, Iman Wilkins believes this Argos was actually in Western Europe, or more specifically in modern-day France, and the Danans are named so after Danas, who was the king of Argos, believed to have been in France. Could these Greek Achaean soldiers, also referenced as Danans or Argives, ruled by their great warrior commander Agamemnon, chief of the war, elected by all the other kings, have come from mainland northwestern Europe? Iman believes the Hellas Sea was the body of water we know today as the English Channel / North Sea, that area there. Homer actually does mention the Achaeans as crossing a, quote here, crossing a wine-coloured body of water en route to Troy, unquote. And to me that does, well, otherwise known as Ilium, as Homer named the city in his poems, which is closer in complexion to the English Channel than that of the clear blue waters of the Aegean. You know, you think of that part of the world and you do not picture wine-coloured water. The writing of Homer's works were said to be written in Ionian Greek. Again, no originals survive, leading one to believe the Ionians would have played a major part in the conflict, when in fact they are referenced only once in the poems. According to the Greek chronicler Thucydides, living around the 5th century BCE, the Ionians were in fact the Greeks, and that they did not possess a fleet of ships until centuries later. So that's in the 5th century BCE. Thucydides is saying that the Greeks didn't even have a fleet of ships. So never mind 1, 2, 3, 700 years before that having a fleet of ships. I shall take this moment to explain the dates that may be possible for the war. According to Homer's works, it is believed the war took place around the 11th century BCE. This time frame seems likely for the first of 2 potential wars, most likely taking place in East Anglia in England, whilst a much later date of the 7th century is given by Wilson and Blackett of a conflict in Anatolia. The later date would allow for the Greek states of the Aegean to potentially, again bearing in mind what Thucydides has just said, to be more established and have a much needed fleet of ships to launch a campaign, though according to Dares, who also we shall come on to in a moment, Greece had no fleet. According to Plato, whilst in Egypt he was told of the Atlanteans warring with the state of Athens in their distant past. Could this have been the migrating force after the fall of Troy in England, migrating from the Atlantic regions perhaps? But I digress on that notion, and we shall look at the migrations further when we come to Brutus and his founding of kingship in Britain during what would become the Brythonic period, one might say, after the renaming of the island from Albion, of which we still pay homage to in the naming of Britain after him today. It is no secret that many names of the locations found in the Iliad are littered around the Mediterranean, but few realise they are also to be found in the northwest of Europe. I will source out more names and stuff for that in a future video, indicating a transference of peoples and knowledge either east to west, or as I am beginning to believe, from west to east, after the fall of the first city of Troy millennia ago. I should also mention other locations had the name Troy at varying times in history, from Iceland to Turkey, with several in England alone. We have Troia Nova, later named Trinobantum, which is today modern London. A town of Troy can also be found even to this day in modern day Surrey, and I have put that in a previous video somewhere. A name mentioned earlier in the video, one Snorri Sturluson, in his prologue to his works, the Eddas, references that Asgard also went by the name of Troy, which must have been at least pre the 12th century due to the age of his works, and remember, his works was a compilation of older works. I do not claim Asgard and Troy are one and the same, though this correlation I found interesting, and it's really interesting. The writings of Homer's poems have many points of contention, and we are only just beginning to build a picture. Homer makes several references also to the tides when discussing the sailing fleet, the beaching of the vessels, and channels cut into the sand to allow the ships to land as far up the beach as possible. And to be honest, I'm not going to go too much into like the tides and the seas and things like that in this video. We'll probably cover that in a later video, but I advise anyone to look into it for themselves, as with all of this material. There is plenty more to come in terms of the geography of both Troy in England and Hisarlik in Anatolia, and there's a lot to cover. Let us take a short look now at the writings of Dares the Phrygian, who also makes reference to the events before the Trojan War. One such event is the destruction of Troy by none other than Hercules, who destroyed and plundered the city. So to quote Dares now, "They came from Sigium at night, Hercules, Telamon, and Peleus led the army into the country, leaving Castor and Pollux and Nestor behind to guard the ships." I'll just say that quick though, Castor and Pollux, that makes me think of Ferrex and Pollux, discussed by Geoffrey of Monmouth. He discusses very similar names. So they were left behind to guard the ships. When news was brought to King Laomedon that the Greek fleet had landed at Sigium, he took command of the cavalry for himself and went to the shore to begin hostilities. Cha-ching, cha-ching. But Hercules, having gone to Troy, was beginning to besiege the unsuspecting inhabitants of the city. When Laomedon learned what was happening at home, he tried to return, but the Greeks stood in his way and Hercules slew him. Telamon proved his prowess by being the first one to enter the city of Troy. Therefore Hercules gave him Laomedon's daughter Hesione. Needless to say, all those who went with Laomedon were killed. At this time, Priam was in Phrygia, where Laomedon, his father, had put him in charge of the army. Hercules and those who came with him plundered the city, the country, and carried off much booty to their ships. When they decided to set off home, Telamon took Hesione with him. When the news brought to Priam that his father had been killed, his fellow citizens decimated, his country plundered, and his sister carried off as spoils of war, he was deeply upset to think the Greeks had treated Phrygia in such contempt. He travelled to Troy along with his wife Hecuba and his children Hector, Alexander, Deiphobos, Helenus, Troilus, Andromache, Cassandra, and Polyxena. He had other sons by concubines, but only those by lawfully wedded wives could claim to be true royal lineage. Arriving in Troy, he saw to the maximum fortification of the city. He built stronger walls and stationed a greater number of soldiers nearby. Troy should not fall again as it had under his father Laomedon, due to a lack of preparedness. He also constructed an altar and statue to Jupiter, sent Hector into Paeonia, built the gates of Troy. The gates are as follows, to be fair: the Antenorian, the Dardanian, the Ilian, the Scian, and the Thymbraean, and the Trojan gate. When he saw that Troy was secure, he waited until the time seemed right to avenge his father, all that his father had suffered. Then he summoned Antenor, and he wished him to go as an envoy to Greece. The Greek army, he said, had done him grave wrongs by killing his father Laomedon and by carrying off Hesione. Nevertheless, if Hesione was returned, he would cease to complain. Unquote. So there we have King Priam mentions the Phrygians being treated in such contempt, which I take to mean the Trojan people are Phrygian. Indeed, Priam himself was in Phrygia when his father was slain by Hercules, which will be significant later down the road as we go deeper into the Trojan War, the Trojan peoples, and who they were in relation to Phrygia and Brutus. Antenor boards a ship and does as his King Priam requests and sets sail to find an agreement to bring back Hesione. Interesting to note that whenever the Trojans visit Greece, the Greeks, the use of boats is vital and ultimately necessary, and you've just got to think back to what Dares and Thucydides have said. There was no fleet of ships. That's in the 5th century. Of course, Dares is believed to have been around the Trojan War himself. Given that Greece is made up of many islands and supposed states littered around the Aegean, one would think if one was to visit these states, then the need for ships and for travel is of course vital, as I've just said. However, as mentioned by Thucydides earlier on, and Dares in a moment, they didn't have any ships. So quoting from Dares again now. Immediately Priam summoned his sons and all of his friends, Antenor, Anchises, Aeneas, who was obviously well known, Bucolion, Panthus, and Lampus, and all of the sons he had fathered by concubines. When they had come, He told them about Antenor's unsuccessful mission, how he had gone to Greece and demanded a satisfaction for Laomedon's death and the return of Hesiod, and how the Greeks had treated him scornfully and sent him home empty-handed. Now Priam concluded, since the Greeks refused to do as he wished, he would send an army to make them pay for their crimes, lest they think barbarians worthy of scorn. And he urged his sons, especially Hector, since he was the oldest, to take command of the forces. Hector responded by saying that he would carry out his father's wishes and avenge the death of his grandfather, Laomedon, and the other injustices the Greeks had done to the Trojans. Bear in mind, this is a translation where it refers to the Achaeans as Greeks. I could replace that in a heartbeat. He feared, however, that the Trojan expedition would fail, for Europe had bred, get on this, many warlike men who would come to the aid of Greece. Many European warlike men who would come to the aid of Greece. Then Alexander began to extort them. They must build a fleet and go against Greece. If his father wished, he would take charge of this venture. He would conquer the enemy and return from Greece with great renown. And we see this of Arthur 1, also when he goes into Europe and destroys Rome and stuff, or conquers Rome. There was reason to believe that the gods would aid him, for while hunting in the woods on Mount Ida, he had fallen asleep and dreamt as follows. Mercury brought Juno, Venus, and Minerva to him to judge of their beauty. Then Venus promised, if he judged her most beautiful, to give him in marriage whoever was deemed the loveliest woman in Greece, Venus being Aphrodite. Thus finally, on hearing Venus's promise, he judged her most beautiful. This dream inspired Priam, and with hope that Venus would aid Alexander, and Deiphobus approved of what Alexander had said. He believed that the Greeks would return his sister Hesiod and make reparations if, as had been proposed, they would send a fleet against Greece. Helenus, however, began to predict that if Alexander brought home a Greek wife, the Greeks would pursue and overpower Troy, and slay, O cruel might, his parents and brothers. But Troilus, who though the youngest of Priam's sons, equalled Hector in bravery, urged them to war, and told them not to be frightened by Helenus's fearful words. And so they unanimously decided to ready the fleet and set out for Greece. Priam sent Alexander and Deiphobus into Paeonia to raise an army they called the people to assembly. Having arranged a line of command beginning with his older and ending with his younger sons, he told how the Greeks had wronged the Trojans. He had sent Antenor as an envoy to Greece to regain his sister Hesiod and obtain reparations for the Trojans. But the Greeks had treated Antenor scornfully and sent him home empty-handed. For this reason, he had decided to send Alexander with a fleet against Greece. Thus, Alexander would avenge the death of his grandfather and the other wrongs that the Trojans had suffered. Then Priam ordered Antenor to tell how he had been treated in Greece. Antenor briefly described his mission, and urging the Trojans to have no fear, made them more eager for war against Greece. Then Priam asked for others' opinions. Would anyone like to speak out against war? He asked. Thereupon Panthus, addressing himself to the king and his party, told that he had heard from his father Euphorbus, if Alexander brought home a wife from Greece, Troy would utterly fall. It was much better, he said, to spend one's life in peace than to risk the loss of liberty in war. Smart advice, but sometimes war is necessary. Panthus' speech won the contempt of the people, and they asked the king what had to be done. When he had told them that they must build ships to go against Greece and gather supplies for the army, they cried out that they were ready to obey any order he gave them. For this he thanked them profusely, and then dismissed the assembly. Unquote. Upon studying this passage, we can see Hector thought the Greeks had no fleet, since he also feared the Greeks would rely on warlike Europeans as allies, which could be significant as we come into this stuff more detailed in the future. He also makes reference to a Mount Ida and a woodland there in which he dreamt whilst resting on a hunt, in where Alexander or Paris chooses the goddess Venus or Aphrodite to be the most beautiful goddess, similar to the Homeric version, only here the action of doing so takes place in a dream as opposed to a literal interaction. The Ida Hills, situated around 20 miles to the west of Troy in Cambridge, actually it's to the southeast, I made a typo there, it's to the east and to the southeast in Cambridge, are clearly there, containing springs and woodlands, which you'd think would be fit for hunting and having a little nap. The water of which feeds into the river Ouse, which also, remember, there's supposed to be several rivers that feed into the Scamander, or otherwise the Ouse. After looking around out of interest, I found a Mount Ida to the northwest of Troy, in Cambridgeshire that is, in the southern Cumbrian mountains of England, which also happens to have a great number of woodlands in the vicinity, with the word lunar, a possible etymologically older word of lunar, referenced on maps. Could this be a location whereas Alexander dreamt? So again, we've got the Ida Hills, like to the southeast of Troy in Cambridgeshire, or the Gog Magog Hills as we'll come on to in later videos. And then if you come up northwest, you've got the area there where you've got Mount Ida, and you've got a number of woodlands and references to lunar. Now in this book here, in this one by Wilson and Blackett, in that book somewhere he makes reference to the fact that Laurentians, or the older English before England and Brutus and all that kind of stuff, there's a lot of moon worshipping that took place in and around these areas in England. Excuse me. So the correlation is fascinating, and I think we might circle back to this in a future video with more information. There is also a Mount Ida in Anatolia, around 70 kilometers away from the ruins to the southeast of Hisarlik. Whilst Mount Ida is closer to Ilium in Turkey than the Mount Ida of England, not the Ida Hills, the two mountains, as I say, this area of Anatolia is very arid, even by today's standards, when we're supposed to have a lot cooler climates than it was back then. The soil is still sandy, you know, it's very arid rather than nice, lush, fertile plains as described by Homer in the Iliad. It is claimed also that Zeus took the side of the Trojans and observed the battles from a position on Ida. Now unfortunately it doesn't say Mount Ida or the hills of Ida, so that's why I've put all three of those in this video, because we've got two Mount Idas, one in England, one in Turkey, but we've got the Ida Hills, which are relatively close, which have springs, which is also referenced in the geography of the Iliad and the Ilium, should I say. And to be honest guys, that takes us to the end of this video. Now, I apologize, going through that video there I was tongue twisting left, right and centre, but the main focus of this video was literally to just start. We just needed to start. I needed to get some general information out there, give you some information on the characters, who was at play. I mean, there's so many more characters that have got to come into play, you know, like your Ajaxes and things like that. There's two Ajaxes, where they came from, the locations, places like Crete, any of the other locations. We are going to discuss them all further in the future. Hisarlik, and as I just mentioned a few moments ago, the Gog-Magog Hills. These are two very different locations geographically, and like the areas all around them, like the things that are there, the trees, the plant life, the springs, the rivers, all this kind of stuff. So we've got all that to touch on. We've got a lot more breaking down to do, and I apologise again for the state of my voice. Like I say, I'm just coming off a pretty rough chest infection, but yeah, I hope you enjoyed that and it wasn't too difficult. I am going to try and do a visual to go with this video, so you've got some visual references as well. And there's a lot more to come now. I'm hoping that maybe I won't do large videos like this. Maybe we'll break it down to like 15-minute videos and be more specific with the content and more specific with the breakdowns of the information. So again, thank you for stopping by, guys. I hope you all had a lovely holidays. I wish you all the best in 2023. I hope you get everything you wish for, and I'll catch you in the next video. Peace.